A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, the novelization of the movie by Jeffrey Cooper. Chapter 1. Kristen Parker looked at the clock on her nightstand and lowered her voice. "He's so weird," she whispered into the telephone, glancing nervously at the door to her bedroom. Kristen never understood why her parents made such a big fuss about letting her use the phone late at night. It wasn't as if... "Kristen!" called the harsh voice from down the hall. "I gotta go," said Kristen. "See you tomorrow." She hung up the phone and switched on the radio just before her mother entered the room. "Your father and I are trying to get some sleep," said Mrs. Parker, glaring angrily at her teenage daughter. "It's just the radio." "Go to sleep," said her mother, saving Kristen the trouble of having to elaborate on her lie. "And stay off the damn telephone." The girl waited until her mother left the room before sticking out her tongue and making a terrible face. She sighed deeply and lay back on the bed. Sometimes she wondered if her parents would have been different if they didn't have so much goddamn money. She smiled grimly at the thought of all those kids at school who envied her because she lived in such a fancy home and always wore expensive clothes. If they knew what it was really like to be Kristen Parker. Kristen turned off the light and closed her eyes, only half listening to the announcer on the radio as he droned on about the talk show that was scheduled for later that evening. "And the suicide rate among 15 to 19-year-olds has increased by an astonishing 20%. Why are our children killing themselves, and what can we do about it? Join us on talk radio." But Kristen never heard the station's call letters, nor found out when the program would be on. In a few seconds she was fast asleep, and it was not until she felt the breeze in her hair and noticed the leaves falling on her face that she opened her eyes. Kristen was not in her room anymore. She was still in her own bed, all right, but her bed was now out in the middle of a deserted street. Kristen climbed out of bed and found herself looking at an old house she vaguely remembered seeing in a dream before. The house on Elm Street. "Mother?" she whispered, not really expecting a reply. And then she heard the children's voices. She stepped closer and saw them, dressed in their finest party clothes, as they jumped rope in front of the old house. The tune they were singing was strangely familiar, and Kristen wondered where she ever could have heard those strange words before. "What is this place?" asked Kristen. One of the little girls looked up while the others scattered. Kristen repeated her question, but the little girl just giggled and climbed onto a shiny red tricycle that stood in one corner of the cluttered lawn. With an eerie laugh, the girl pedaled into the house at incredible speed and disappeared. For reasons she couldn't possibly have explained, Kristen opened the door and stepped inside. Startled by the harsh clanging of a wind chime, she looked up at the 4 metal tubes hanging in the doorway. For a split second, they looked exactly like 4 long, straight razors. "Hello?" she said. The house was dark, but Kristen could see by the moonlight shining through the broken windows that the room in which she now stood was completely empty, except for a few dead leaves on the floor. Then she heard a metallic whirring noise coming from one of the back rooms. She stepped farther into the home and opened a large pair of sliding doors that she hadn't noticed when she first came in. The huge room was filled with hundreds of twisted tricycles, like some obscene parody of an automobile graveyard. Kristen had barely noticed that the floor was awash with blood when a large, riderless bicycle rolled up into the room. It was a bicycle built for 2, with bloody spikes where its seat should be, and 2 glistening straight razors for handbrakes. And then she saw him in the shadows, the man in the red and green sweater. There was a grotesque grin on his burnt face as he crooned to her in a horrible, throaty voice that no songwriter on earth could ever have imagined, except perhaps in her worst nightmare. "Kristen! Kristen! Give me your answer! I'm half crazy!" Kristen began to run, screaming as she descended what seemed to be an endless stairway, hurtling as fast as she could through the darkness to put as much distance as possible between herself and the terrible man at the top of the stairs. At last she came to the bottom of the stairs and staggered through a narrow doorway, gasping for breath. She flipped on the light and saw the bodies of 100 teenagers hanging lifelessly from the rafters, their eyes wide open and their purple tongues lolling obscenely from their mouths. Kristen screamed and turned around, crashing into the man with the red and green sweater. He was laughing triumphantly now as he held her in his arms, the razors at his fingertips cold against her neck. "I have to wake up," she said out loud, determined not to join the gallery of death in the room behind her. "I have to wake up!" And then Kristen was alone in her room. She jumped out of the bed and stared at herself in the bedroom mirror, through tears of fear and anger and frustration. For just a moment, she imagined the horrible man with the burnt face creeping up behind her, putting his terrible hands on her shoulders. She knew he wasn't really there, that he was trapped in the dream she had barely managed to escape. But the mere thought of the evil creature with the razor-tipped glove was suddenly more than she could bear. Kristen picked up a heavy paperweight from her dresser and heaved it at the mirror, shattering it into a dozen pieces. Then she fell to her knees, picked up the sharpest piece of glass she could find, and slashed it violently across her wrists. Dr. Neil Guinness paused at the nurse's station and greeted the burly black orderly who stood there watching a local news report on the epidemic of teenage suicides. "How's it going, Max?" asked the young psychiatrist. "All quiet on the Western Front," the orderly replied. Max had been on night duty at the adolescent ward all that week, and he often thought he would have quit his grueling job at Weston Hills Psychiatric Hospital long ago if it weren't for a few good doctors like Neil Guinness. "How's Kincaid today?" asked Neil. Max shrugged and shook his head from side to side. "He's in the quiet room," he said. Neil nodded and headed for the quiet room. He had never fully approved of strapping disturbed adolescents into the big metal chair bolted to the floor, but he had to accept the unpleasant fact that sometimes patients had to be forcibly restrained for their own protection. Still, he was constantly arguing with Dr. Madalena about what he considered to be her excessive use of the quiet room. Come to think of it, he reflected with a grim smile, he seemed to argue with Dr. Madalena about damn near everything these days. How that woman with her antiquated ideas ever came to run a modern institution like Weston Hills was something Neil never expected to understand. Neil peeked in through the mesh grid window of the quiet room and studied the boy struggling to escape from the heavy leather straps that bound his wrists and ankles to the steel chair. Sometimes it was hard to remember that Kincaid was just a 17-year-old boy, standing well over 6 feet and weighing something in excess of 250 pounds. Kincaid gave off an aura of menace even in his gentlest of moods. The fact that his bullet-shaped head was completely devoid of hair only contributed to the notion that this was someone you would be wise to avoid running into on a dark street corner. Neil was about to open the door to the quiet room when he felt an icy hand on his shoulder. "Not now, Doctor," said the hard voice of Dr. Madalena. "We've just managed to calm him down." Neil glanced at his boss for a moment and then looked back at the boy inside the room. He had specifically asked Dr. Madalena not to medicate his patients unless absolutely necessary. But the older psychiatrist's notion of necessity seemed to differ consistently from his own. Sometimes Neil had the feeling that his boss was going out of her way to goad him into a showdown that they both knew he could not win. Neil was determined to put off the inevitable bit of unpleasantness for as long as possible. The kids needed him after all, and he was prepared to put up with a lot of bullshit, if it meant keeping his job at Weston Hills. "I imagine you've heard about the new assistant," said Dr. Madalena, leading Neil away from the quiet room and into the doctor's lounge. I heard some kind of rumor about help from downtown," said Neil, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "It's more than just a rumor, I'm afraid," said Dr. Madalena. "Some of the parents have been complaining about the way we do things around here, and the city council decided we needed some community input." "I just don't like the way this makes any of us look," said Neil, in an uncharacteristic burst of anger. "We're all professionals around here. Don't credentials and experience count for anything in medicine anymore?" "Perhaps in medicine," said Dr. Madalena with a deep sigh, "but not in politics, which is what this ultimately boils down to. Anyway, there's nothing any of us can do at this point. The cavalry is on its way, and we'll just have to wait and make the best of an unpleasant situation. I'm sure she won't get in anybody's way." "She?" Before Dr. Madalena could elaborate, Max came running into the lounge. "We got another one in the ER!" he shouted. Neil and Dr. Madalena instantly jumped up and raced toward the emergency room. "Her name's Kristen Parker," explained the nurse, struggling to hold down the girl, who violently resisted efforts to staunch the flow of blood from her torn wrist. "Get away from me, you bastard!" the girl screamed, her eyes glazed and her features contorted in fear and disgust. Max rushed to Kristen's side, using his considerable mass to steady the girl, while one of the doctors attempted to stitch up her bloody wrists. Suddenly the girl twisted away, throwing Max across the room with the force that seemed to belie the considerable difference in their sizes. Flinging herself into the corner of the room, she knocked a tray of instruments to the floor and picked up a large pair of surgical scissors. From the way she held the scissors in front of her, no one in the room doubted that she would skewer the first person who dared to come near. Neil prayed that the girl would not decide to turn the scissors on herself. "No one's going to hurt you," he said, taking a tentative step forward. Kristen jabbed at him with the scissors, and he quickly stepped back. Neil stood there helplessly as the girl began to rock slowly from side to side, eerily singing to herself in a weak and trembly voice. 5, 6, grab your crucifix. 7, 8, better stay up late. 9, 10. Suddenly Kristen stopped and stared at the figure who had just appeared in the doorway.
"Never sleep again,"
said the voice of Nancy Thompson, completing Kristen's rhyme. Neil turned to see the young woman framed in the doorway, her eyes locked on those of Kristen Parker. Suddenly Kristen stopped rocking, and her eyes cleared as she let the scissors drop to the floor. Suddenly drained of energy, the girl fell to her knees and began to cry. The doctors immediately rushed to her side, meeting with no resistance, as they hastily treated her wounds.
"Who taught you that rhyme, Kristen?"
demanded Nancy, but the girl just sat on the floor staring at Nancy, as if suddenly rediscovering a long-lost friend. The cavalry has arrived, thought Neil Guinness. Chapter 2. "What was that all about?" asked Neil as he sat across from Nancy at the cafeteria table. Nancy took a sip of hot black coffee and shrugged her shoulders.
"Just an old nursery rhyme. Something kids use to ward off the boogeyman."
"You believe in the boogeyman?" asked Neil.
"Maybe,"
said Nancy with a smile. She was enjoying their flirtatious banter, especially after the tense scene in the emergency room. It had been a long time since Nancy had felt this comfortable with a man. She began to think about the first time she kissed Glenn, at the sophomore dance. Then she forced herself to return to the present. There was something about this handsome young doctor that made her want to tell him things she had not talked to anyone about for many years. Nancy was very glad that her professor had used his influence on the city council to get her this position at the hospital. When she decided to go for a degree in psychological counseling after what happened on Elm Street, Nancy swore that she would do whatever she could to help other young people in trouble. Getting this job at Weston Hills in the middle of a teenage suicide epidemic was like the answer to her prayers, and meeting Neil Guinness was like icing on the cake.
Tell me, Dr. Guinness.
"Call me Neil," he said with a smile.
Neil.
She said, returning the smile.
What do you think is going on around here?
Neil considered a wisecrack and then thought better of it. "It's hard to say," he replied with a shrug of his broad shoulders. "It could be environmental, maybe drug-related."
None of the kids, victims or survivors, was using drugs.
"There's a reason for everything," said Neil, a slight tone of annoyance creeping into his voice. He was beginning to like this young woman very much, but he didn't much like being reminded that he didn't have a clue as to why young people were suddenly killing themselves off in unprecedented numbers.
I'm sure there's a perfectly logical explanation,
said Nancy soothingly.
I just can't figure out what the hell it could be.
"You know, I used to work in a veterans hospital," said Neil. "There's something called delayed stress syndrome that you see a lot of in those kind of places, and it closely resembles what these kids seem to be going through."
Shell shock?
asked Nancy. "In a manner of speaking, it's like they've been in some sort of heavy combat, and they can't quite figure out how to deal with it."
Combat,
echoed Nancy. "Right," said Neil, feeling vaguely annoyed by the imprecision of his diagnosis. "The vets get better eventually, and, these kids will too,"
I wouldn't count on it,
said Nancy. "Is that your professional opinion, Doctor?" asked Neil sarcastically. Nancy looked him in the eye and saw that this was neither the time nor the place to tell him her own admittedly bizarre-sounding theory of what was going on.
I'm tired,
she said.
We'll talk more in the morning.
"Whatever you say," replied Neil. As Nancy was getting up to leave, she said,
One more thing. Do any of the kids have nightmares?
"It's funny you should ask that, actually," said Neil, caught off guard by Nancy's perceptive question. "I've hooked them up to the EEG machine, and none of them seems to have REM sleep."
You mean...
"They don't dream," said Neil, nodding his head. "I almost get the impression they're afraid to dream." Nancy was about to tell Neil something very important about her own experience in the world of dreams when she accidentally knocked over her purse. Neil bent down to help her pick up the spilled contents and paused over a bottle of large yellow pills. Hypnosil 60 milligrams read the label. Nancy snatched the bottle out of his hands and put it back in her purse.
Good night, Doctor,
she said, suddenly feeling more than a little uneasy. "Good night," he said. He waited until Nancy was out of sight before taking a pad out of his jacket pocket and jotting down the name of her medication. Neil had to look in the latest supplement to his pharmaceutical reference book to find any mention of Hypnosil. It read, "Experimental, caution the text. Effective for the management of the manifestations of psychotic disorders. Possibly effective for sedation where dreamless sleep is considered optimal and for suppression of night terrors." Neil closed the book and made a mental note to remember that all of Nancy Thompson's observations about mental health did not necessarily come out of an introductory psych book. Kristen Parker went to sleep that night clutching a crucifix tightly to her chest. She had never considered herself especially religious. The Parker family had always gone to church on the major holidays and given generously to all the right charities, but somehow the discussion of spiritual matters had never been a central feature of the family's religious life. Still, Kristen clung to the belief that there had to be something out there bigger and more important than just our brief lives on this tiny planet, tucked away in an obscure corner of the galaxy. She had never been able to share her mother's disdain for people who espoused unconventional religious viewpoints. Whether they chose to call the universal life force Allah or Tao or the great Hunkamunka, Kristen figured everybody was basically talking about the exact same thing. As she began to get sleepy, Kristen glanced at the tiny figure on the crucifix and wondered if Christ had suffered as she herself was now suffering. She closed her eyes, feeling warm and secure in her confidence that God, whatever she might turn out to be, was watching over her as she slept. And while Kristen slept, the figure on the crucifix began to writhe in pain, its eyes glowing red like two tiny hot coals. Kristen awoke suddenly to the sound of a squeaky wheel. She looked across the room and saw a tricycle slowly melting, as if from some intense inner heat. Kristen climbed out of bed and walked through the door, knowing even as she did so that she would soon be back in that strange house that haunted her dreams every night. The house on Elm Street. And she knew too that she had to pass through that all too familiar living room until she found the cellar door, and that she would open the cellar door and that he would be there as he always was, as large as life and 10 times as ugly.
"Kristen, did you cross yourself today?"
asked the man with the burnt face, leering at Kristen as he crossed himself with his razored glove, blood and pus oozing from his rotting skin. Kristen began to scream, the man in the striped sweater just a few steps behind, as she ran up the stairs in terror. And then she was alone in a dark corridor. There was a doorway at the end of the hall, and Kristen felt compelled to step inside the simply furnished room. She only took one step before sinking through the room's liquid floor, gasping for breath as the furniture somehow remained suspended on the unsolid floor above her. She swam with difficulty to the surface, grabbing hold of a chair as her head broke the surface. She only had time to take one quick breath before a razored hand shot up from somewhere below, pulling her back into the murky waters. Kicking and squirming, Kristen broke free, and with a tremendous burst of will struggled to solid ground. And then the creature reappeared from beneath the water, only now it took the form of a horrible serpent, with the leering face of the man in the red and green sweater. "Help me!" cried Kristen, as the disgusting creature cornered her at the end of the upstairs hallway, its razor-sharp fangs already closing over her ankles. "Nancy!" Nancy was sitting up in bed writing in her diary when the pen suddenly jumped out of her hand and the diary went flying across the room. She barely had time to wonder what was going on before she was pulled down into the center of her bed, only to crash through an enormous mirror in her old house on Elm Street. Nancy scrambled to her feet and looked around. What in the world was she doing in her old house? And then she heard Kristen's screams. Without a moment's hesitation, Nancy ran down a seemingly endless series of corridors until she found the screaming girl swallowed up to her neck by a giant serpent with the face of Freddy Krueger. The huge snake stopped swallowing for just a second to study Nancy with its watery yellow eyes. A smile seemed to play across its wide, leathery lips.
"What am I doing here?"
screamed Nancy in frustration as she clawed angrily at the creature's burnt face with her fingernails. "You're in my dream," gasped Kristen helplessly. I brought you here to help me."
"Then wish us out of here,"
said Nancy, jamming her thumb hard into the creature's eye. Kristen nodded and took a deep breath just as Freddy's dislocated jaw began to close over her face. "I wish we were back in our own beds," she said, and as Freddy's jaws closed on empty air, Nancy found herself plummeting into the safety of her own bed. She looked around warily and saw the open bottle of pills on her nightstand. With a sudden intense fury, she picked up the bottle and hurled it violently against the wall.
Damn pills don't work anymore,
she said, collapsing on the bed in tears. It wasn't until she buried her face in her hands that she noticed the charred shreds of burnt human flesh that still clung to her fingernails. Okay, Slashaholics, this has been chapters 1 and 2 of A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, the novelization by Jeffrey Cooper. I have been so excited about starting on this book, and I'm glad we're finally on it. Like I've said before, these novelizations of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies are short compared to the other ones, but obviously they're pretty entertaining. I really enjoyed the novelization for part 1, even though it was pretty true, like, down to a T of the movie. There were a few slight differences, but there's supposed to be several differences in this book compared to Dream Warriors. For instance, I'm calling her Kristen like the movie did, but in the book it says Kirsten, and I didn't even notice that at first until like the 3rd page of saying Kristen. And can anybody else name the differences from the movie and what happened in the chapter tonight? I think that'll be a fun game going forward. In the comments section, guys, if you notice any differences from the movie in these narrations I do of the book for part 3, then let me know in the comment section which differences that you caught. I caught a couple. Did you catch them? And, I'll be back very soon with more of Dream Warriors. Also want to give a big shout out to our $15 patron, Cecilia Spears, who is voicing Nancy Thompson for A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. And if anybody listening right now would also like to voice a character in any of the audiobooks I do on the channel, all you got to do is sign up on Patreon on the $15 tier or higher, and those tiers come with the guest spot where you can voice a character for an entire book every month that you're a paying patron. And you're going to be helping the channel out a lot and helping it keep going and growing for years to come by doing so. Until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, and
Pleasant dreams!